So when I first started to sew, I didn't realise how much there was to learn. At times it became frustrating, overwhelm, imposter syndrome, you name it, I had it. In those moments that you have, they're really vulnerable moments actually, and you may feel the really strong urge to give up sewing. So this video is for those of you who are at that stage, who really want to sew but are frustrated and they are on the verge of giving up. Watch this video through to the end before you do that, because I think I might turn your mind around. Before we get into it, if we're just meeting, my name's Claire. On this channel I talk about dressmaking, garment sewing and sewing in general. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in and you like the content of this video, do hit subscribe. Join me on Instagram, where you can see up-to-date information both on my sewing journey and my carnivore journey, because I've lost 100 pounds in weight. So let's get into the doodahs. So there's a lot of reasons why we might sew, and our own personal reasons are individual to us. There could be a range of things. Maybe we just need to let off steam, not think about something else, do something for ourselves. Maybe we want to develop our skills. Maybe we want a creative outlet. Maybe we just need clothes and we're desperate for clothes and we just want to learn how to make them. Maybe when you go shopping for clothes, you can't find clothes that fit your particular body and you feel you would benefit from this skill that is sewing. There can be many, many reasons. And I would say the reason that you come to sewing is the motivation you have for sewing, because as I said in the introduction, you're going to have a long journey, and that's not to put anyone off, because sewing can be really, really rewarding. But when you do start to sew, you just don't realise the amount of skills and techniques that you need to learn. I remember when I started to sew that I learned a technique which I think was just sewing in a straight line, and I was like, well, hey, I'm away now, I can sew. And then I started using patterns, and they're like, do a buttonhole or do a placket or do burrito method. The list goes on and on. So however much you think you've learned in sewing, there's always more that you can learn. Now, those of you that have been sewing for many, many years may disagree. You may say, I know how to do everything now, but I would argue there are always new ways to learn, or more efficient ways, more contemporary ways to learn how to do stuff. So once you take up the hobby of sewing, you're never ever going to stop learning. And for me now, with 10 plus years experience in it, I see that as a positive. At the beginning, it felt like a mountain that I had to climb over and that I was never going to get the hang of, particularly in the beginning when I didn't understand construction. So that raised lots more problems than someone who does understand construction would. So if you are at the beginning of your journey, do take the time to learn construction and understand where if you do a small bust adjustment, it's going to affect the hemline and other things. Yeah, that's probably the biggest tip I could ever give you, is learn construction, because it will make your whole life a lot easier. Getting back to our motivation, our reason for wanting to sew, I think it can have benefits in terms of hobbies, filling our time, giving us something to do, but it can also raise our self-esteem. It can be fantastic for that. I know when I'm out and about and someone says, oh, I like your top, where did you get it? And if I say I made it, they act like I'm a complete genius, like I am Einstein himself. It is, when you don't sew, you really believe there is this thing that is so difficult to overcome. And it's not, it is just learning little steps. There's lots and lots of steps, but they are only to learn the little steps. And little steps become bigger steps, and before you know it, you can do the bigger steps because you've done the little steps. Am I making any kind of sense here? So learning the skills of dressmaking can really raise your self-esteem, because I know when I've made a garment, I'm really proud of myself. I remember the first dress I ever made, which was the Bettine by Tilly and the Buttons. And afterwards I was so gobsmacked with myself that I actually made that dress. I just kept staring at it for days and days. I was like, I made it. I didn't buy it from shop. I made it with my own hands. And it just really, really raised my self-esteem. So sewing can be fantastic for that. It can be mindful. When you are sewing, you are focused on what you're actually doing. You have to concentrate on what you're doing. You're using a dangerous machine after all. It really can take you out of yourself. I don't know about you, but when I'm not occupying myself, when I've got some free time, I ruminate a lot, and it can become a problem because I end up boring myself apart from anything else. But it can make your problems seem a lot bigger than they actually are. But when you are sewing, you have to concentrate. You have to focus on what you're doing, so everything gets taken out of your mind for however long you're sewing, and you're just enjoying the process. That can bring fantastic mental health relief. Not just mental health issues, but it can release stress as well. If you've got a really stressful life, maybe you've got a big family that you have to take care of and you need some me time. Maybe you've got a really demanding job like I used to have, and my sewing was just an outlet to help me forget all of that, because it was a high pressure job working in the mental health industry. I would come home and I would sew, and it would just take me out of my world, and that brings so many benefits, not to mention the practical benefits of actually making clothes that fit you, that look good on you, that are in your particular size. Say, like if your top is bigger than your bottoms or vice versa, you can tailor between sizes, you can do adjustments to make sure it contours to your own particular body, and that can be fantastic. Perhaps depending on the type of clothes that you buy in the shop and the type of fabric that you buy at home for sewing, you could potentially save some money. I'm not completely convinced on that one, but some people do believe that you can save money. So there are so many benefits to sewing, and one, I guess if you're watching this video, you're already on board with that. You know sewing is a really good thing to do, and you really want to do it. You're there, you've got your motivation, you've got your why, and it keeps you going. We're now going to talk about what happens when your motivation starts to wane and you start wondering, have I made the right decision here? So when we come to sewing, we've probably seen others doing it online, and we believe that is a really good thing to do. I talked in my last video about FOMO, where we want what we haven't got. We've got this fear of missing out. So we're on Instagram, for example. Follow me on Instagram. I'm trying to grow my account over there. If you're on Instagram, you might be following these influencers who make clothes, and on Instagram they have the best photographs, do they not, of their makes, usually out in some high climate like Hawaii background or something, and it just looks so Moorish. We've got to have it now. We want a bit of that. And that's exactly how I came to sew. Well, not how I came to sew, but how I came to be on YouTube sewing. But with anything in life, reality versus the internet is not the same thing. So we decide to start sewing. We buy a sewing machine, we buy our thread, our needles, our fabric, our patterns, everything we need, our scissors. We buy it and we start doing it. And at first, it's really good. It's really rewarding. We're learning, we're making lots of mistakes, but we are learning. And we, as I've spoken about, we end up having a garment and we're in awe of it. We're like, wow, I made that. And it keeps us going, but eventually we come upon stumbling blocks. It might be that you've been sailing through making shift dresses, and then you wanted to try maybe a jacket, and you come unstuck because of the buttonholes or because of the plackets or the vents. Maybe the vents have, stopped you in your tracks. Maybe it's putting the lining in and you've never done it before and you're doing it all wrong and you've sewn the sleeve to the shoulder, and we've all been there, haven't we? We've all been there. What happens is we get frustrated with it. We make mistakes and we get the seam ripper out and we're ripping the fabric, and the fabric rips and we've got no more spare fabric. We have to go and buy more fabric, and this project is costing more and more by the minute, and you're losing your will to live with it, aren't you? If it is not the actual act of doing it, maybe it's the lack of inspiration. It can almost be, because I spoke in the last video about how we can have so much inspiration that we never know where we're at. Like, we're doing a project and we see something else we want to make and our mind goes to that, and then there's the next thing and the next thing, and we end up with a big pile of projects that we haven't really started. It could be that you really got into sewing, you really enjoyed it, but over time there is too much inspiration out there and it is doing your head in. You do not know where to stop and think. And then it might be that you want to sew these clothes but you don't know your personal style. So maybe you really like the bodycon dresses, you think they look amazing on the models you see on Instagram, but you haven't got the body for a bodycon dress. So you make it and it looks good on the hanger, and then you pull it on and you are devastated. If you do that enough times, believe me, I know, if you do that enough times, it is going to start to wane your interest in sewing. It could be that you're attempting projects that are not in your skill set yet. I remember that I made the Rue dress by Colette, and it was a very particular design around the bust, and it was a skill set that I didn't yet have, to be honest. And I could not get it to fit me, and I adapted the patterns, I followed what was online, I adapted it. In the end, I reached out to them and said, can you help? And they did help, or tried to help, and I ended up not sewing for about 3 or 4 weeks because of that. In the end, I found out that that pattern was wrong anyway, and they recalled the pattern later, so it wasn't actually me. But that experience of not being able to fit, or feeling like I was a complete failure, I was like, I'm never going to be able to sew, there's no point trying, and I just had to stop because I've become so frustrated. But obviously, when you've got an addiction, stopping don't actually work. Another reason that you may feel like you want to give up sewing is a lack of time. It could be a lack of space and a lack of resources. So often, not many of us have got the luxury of a sewing room, have we? We've got a sewing machine in the corner of the lounge or the bedroom, as I have. If you've got a family around, it can be really difficult to find the time and the space to sew. If they're always home, they're needing the table for their homework, or your husband wants to watch telly in peace. There could be all sorts of reasons why you never get the time to sew. And when that happens, you will lose interest over time, because it's something that you have to do on the regular to maintain that interest. I'm sure if the reason you have for not wanting to sew anymore is not been listed in what I just spoken about, there are more and more reasons. I could sit here and do a 3-hour video on reasons why people want to give up, but that's not going to help anyone, is it? We know in ourselves why we want to give up. The issue is not convincing ourselves that these are not reasons to not give up. So, for example, if you never get the time to sew, then you might think, I'll give up, and then you'll tell yourself, no, that's not a reason to give up. I should make time. We prioritise our time. If you're struggling to find the time, you're probably not going to put in that effort to fix that problem. But I will say, before I go any further, most reasons to give up sewing can be remedied, apart from probably money. But even then, if money is lacking, you can go to the thrift store and you can pick up bed sheets and things like that if you want to sew for the love of sewing. Or you can upcycle clothes as well. That's always a good option. So there is an answer for everything, really. Sometimes when we've got the mindset that we want to give something up, and this doesn't just apply to sewing, this applies to anything, then it's often not the reason we're telling ourselves why we want to give up. There's some other reason behind that. For example, it's probably going to be some kind of psychological reason. So to use the example we were using just now, if you're not wanting to sew because you haven't got the time and the space to sew, well, that can be remedied, as we've spoken about. But actually, if you know it can be remedied and you're not remedying it, something else is at play there. It's probably a psychological block. You know me with my psychological sewing tips. But it is, you need to really reflect and monitor on your reactions and your feelings, what is happening in your body when you have these thoughts and feelings, and really try and dig deep to see why you're feeling the way you're feeling. Now, I will admit to you, I've been talking to you all about coming back to sewing, and I am, don't panic, I am. And this week I found myself procrastinating, getting started. Basically, I've washed the fabric and I need to iron it. And that is my stumbling block, because I'm like, I can't start the project until I iron the fabric. And I can't iron the fabric because I haven't got the ironing board out. But I could get the ironing board out at any point, couldn't I? That's not the real reason. The real reason is probably because I've got some hangover from when I was sewing before, and I got overwhelmed and I got burnt out, and I was getting demands from my audience, we want more sewing. For a good 6 months after I said I'm not doing it, I was still getting demands in the comments. And so I've still got a bit of, I don't want to say PTSD because that minimises PTSD, but that kind of thing where like it's playing on my mind, do you know what I mean? Where you've got this hangover feeling from a previous experience. Now, it's something I can overcome, but if I hadn't looked within and monitored the feelings I was having as I was thinking about sewing, then I might not realise that it's those other things that are at play there. And I might just think, well, it's just the ironing board, and then just never get the ironing board out. But now I know what's going on. I can monitor that. I can do a little bit at a time. I can not put pressure on myself. I can do all sorts of things in order to ensure that I can still enjoy the process of sewing, even though there is a little bit of procrastination going on. So I would say whatever is your reason for wanting to give up sewing, it is overcomable. Not a word, is it? You can overcome it if you want to, but you've got to want to, and you've got to reflect and work out why. Journaling would be a really good idea with this. If there's anything in life that is worth having, there are going to be times where you've got to get over a hump. If everything was just so easy, it wouldn't be enjoyable or valuable, would it? So we sometimes have to overcome these humps. When you do that, it's going to be much easier. And one way you can do that is to think about the consequences of giving up sewing. So with consequences of anything, there are pros and cons. So for example, if I wanted to start running at the gym, which I actually have done, then there's going to be positives and negatives to that. So my health is going to improve. My cardiovascular health in particular is going to improve. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to tone up. I'm going to be slimmer. All these things are fantastic things. But I've got ME. So if I do that, I'm going to be exhausted and I'm going to be in bed for days. Do you see where I'm going with that? There are pros and cons to whatever we do in life. So let's get back to sewing. If you're going to decide to give up sewing, a hobby that you was enjoying and getting benefit out of, there are going to be benefits of giving it up, but there's also going to be a lot of negatives. This really depends why you came to sewing. So I can't give you a prescriptive if you do this, this is going to happen, because I don't know your reasons. I imagine like you've been frustrated, you've been overwhelmed, you've been stressed out with the sewing, because no one's going to want to give it up if they're not experiencing those things. And if you give it up, you're going to get rid of the stress, you're going to get rid of the frustration, and you're going to get rid of whatever is the problem within the sewing. Giving up is going to stop it in the short term. But you've got to think of the long-term negative effects, because if you came to sewing to relieve your boredom, to have a creative outlet, to make your own clothes, and you're no longer doing it, those problems are re-emerging in the long term. If you're going to give up sewing, what are you going to replace it with? How are you going to fix the issues that sewing solved for you? This is what you've got to ask yourself, because if you're just going to give it up and go back to what you were doing before sewing, which was nothing, then you're back to square one and nothing changes. And you're going to feel bad about yourself, because one of the tenets, if you like, of confidence building, of self-esteem building, is keeping promises to ourselves. And when we decide to take up sewing, we're telling ourselves, I'm going to learn this new skill. I'm going to make clothes. I'm going to have a wardrobe full of clothes. You're making, in essence, promises to yourself. If you then give up at the first or the second or even the third hurdle, you are breaking those promises to yourself, and that is going to reduce your confidence, reduce your self-esteem and your self-worth. Ask me how I know. I gave up sewing 3 years ago and haven't sewed for that time. So I know what I'm talking about here. And all the issues I spoke about the positives of sewing, about relieving depression, anxiety, mental health, stress, being mindful, all of that, you lose all of that. Now, there's lots of other ways. If you don't want to sew and you want to pick up another creative outlet, there's lots and lots of ways you can fulfill that. Sewing's not special in that way, but if sewing is your thing and you're just giving up because you're frustrated, then that seems a real shame to me. So at that point, I was in a slump. I was completely spent. I had no bandwidth for anything. I was overwhelmed. I was burnt out, and I did not know what I was doing. My relationship was in a really bad way. My health was in a really bad way, and it just was no good for me. So it was really important for me to have that break. However, perhaps I didn't need a break for as long as I had. But life had other ideas. I did try to come back to sewing, and I did make a couple of outfits last year. As you will remember, the videos are up. But then because my marriage broke down, again, I was overwhelmed. I was trying to pack up to move, and the move was taking forever. So I wasn't in a position to sew again. And now we're going to go back to it. So I'm not saying that if you need a break, then you shouldn't take a break. Of course, you should take a break, and you should do what is right for you. If you really want to give up sewing, ignore this video, stop watching this video. If you are doing it just for reasons that you don't even understand yourself, then perhaps try and work out what you can do to get back on track. So just before we go any further, if you are enjoying this video, do consider giving me a like, a comment and a subscribe. That is really, really helpful. If you so wish, I would really appreciate a coffee, which is just a tip for all the content that I put out for you. If you do leave a tip, that really shows your appreciation and that I'm doing something right here. The passion isn't what it was with me, and I have been quite open with that in previous videos where I said I'm doing sewing still on this channel just because it's what you guys want. But if we want to rekindle it, there are things that we can do. So I spoke about taking a break, and when I spoke about that, I was suggesting that in terms of if you need a break, take a break, because like no one's a judge of you, are they? It's only you that's judging yourself. But perhaps you could take a strategic break. So if you feel like maybe having a month off is going to renew your energy, gonna give you some vroom back, then maybe that's what you need to do. Maybe just take a month off. Treat it like, like when you go to work and you get some weeks off on holiday because you need to decompress from the stressful work environment. That can be applied here to sewing, because if you're finding sewing really stressful, then you need to decompress, and just putting your sewing stuff away completely if you can will help you decompress, because it'll take the pressure off what project you're going to do next, what fabric you're going to get, how many steps you can do in a night, how much time you can dedicate to it, how much money you can dedicate to it. You can just put all that aside and just worry about enjoying yourself, spending time with your family, getting out and about, doing whatever it is you want to do. You might find in that time that you're really missing sewing and want to come back to it more quickly, or it might be that you have that month off and then you come back, or you have the month off and you decide that sewing's not for you. You're going to know either way by taking that time away from sewing. I know there is a lot of advice out there saying that and people said this to me in the comments when I gave up sewing, was you've just got to push through it. Just do an easy project and push through it. And sometimes that can be the worst thing to do. I think if at that point where I was in overwhelm, that I had continued doing projects, whether they were easy or not, that would have sent me over the edge. So it really is not always the way. It can be. If you are frustrated and want to give up sewing because you've just done 3 big projects back to back and you're spent, then doing another project is not going to help you. It could be that you do just need an easy project. You know yourself best. I can't determine what is best for you. Something else that at times when I haven't fully given up sewing, but I have wanted to give up sewing, or I was just overwhelmed with it, but I wasn't giving up, was I went online and looked for inspiration, because it might have been, and it usually was, that I didn't have a project that I was excited about. So I would go on Instagram and I would look at what other people were making and what patterns were being released. The Fold Line do a video once a month I think it is, where they show you the different patterns that have just been released, and that can be really beneficial. And it's not about necessarily buying those patterns, but you could look at the patterns, find something that you're inspired by, then look through your own stash to see if you've got anything similar, or if buying stuff really excites you and it's going to make your sewing thing come back, then perhaps you do need to buy a sewing pattern. Maybe you could go and look at fabric and see what fabrics you need, if you need fabrics. If you've got a big stash, ignore that bit of advice. Basically, what you want to do in this situation is find a project that you're really excited about, because I know when I'm excited about a project, it is worlds apart than if I'm not. This is why I started buying PDF patterns rather than paper patterns, because paper patterns I had to wait for them for days to arrive. But when I wanted to make a pattern, I wanted to do it straight away. So I'd get the PDF, print it off and cut it out, etc. there and then. And that's what you want. You want a project where you are so excited you want to start there and then. And if you do get that momentum, keep it going, keep working on your project as much as you can so that you don't lose momentum halfway through. So I think while we're talking about strategies for managing your sewing journey, your sewing motivation, it's really, really important to have a moment to talk about time management and stress management within sewing, because sewing is a hobby. It is something we should be enjoying. If we're not enjoying it, there's no point doing it, is there? But that's the point of this video, because I'm saying if you're not enjoying it, there are ways to manage that, and time management is really important. If you've got a really busy life, say you work full time, you've got to come home, do the dinner for the family, clean the house, etc., and you're not going to get to sewing till like 9-10 o'clock, then you'll rush sewing for half an hour before you have to go and have a shower, ready for bed, ready for your next day. That's going to cause you additional stress on top of a hobby that is supposed to take stress away. But similarly, if you are someone at home all day and you do sewing to fill your time, you could have too much time on your hand, and all the time means you can't make decisions and you get imposter syndrome and you get all sorts of things going on. So the two scenarios, although at opposite ends of the spectrum, can have the same result. So time management can become really, really important here. So if you can tell yourself that you can allocate yourself some time, so in the case of the busy scenario, you may prioritise an hour in the evening where you can sit, relax, have a cup of tea and do your sewing, and you can tell the family from 9 till 10 or whatever time you are going to be sewing. You cannot be interrupted. You can prioritise it. Anyone ever says to me they're too busy to do X, Y and Z, especially exercise, I say you're not too busy, you're just not prioritising it. And that is usually the case. There are situations where that's not true, but in the main, if you haven't got time, it's because you're not prioritising the time. And if you've got too much time on your hands, then you can manage your time by saying, I will only sew for 4 hours today instead of 8 hours. And then that will force you to find other things to do. Those remedies for either of those scenarios are going to improve your stress levels, and it's going to make you enjoy the sewing more because you will value it more. So in terms of stress management, I would say if you're getting frustrated while you're sewing, step away from it. Give yourself a break, 10-minute break, 20-minute break, have a water break, have a food break, do whatever you need. Go and watch some TV for half an hour. Let your cortisol levels come down and then go back to it later on or the next day when you are not so stressed. And I'll promise you, because I've done this many, many times, that when you come back to it at a later time, the actual act of doing the sewing and achieving what you want to achieve is going to be so much easier. If you want further information on any of this that I've spoken about, go to YouTube. YouTube, you're watching it now, is a great resource. You will be able to find lots and lots of information. It might not be in the sewing niche, but in maybe the psychology niche, you can find time management, stress management. There's a whole niche on YouTube about productivity. Some of those videos, and there'll be skills that you can transfer over to sewing to make your sewing life not only easier but more enjoyable. So the thing I really want you to understand in all of this is that sewing should be enjoyable. It is a hobby, it's a pastime, it's something we do for the love of it. It's not something we're obligated to do, or it shouldn't be. It's not something that we're doing because we get financial gain out of it. It's just something we do for the pure pleasure of it. So if you are sewing and you are not feeling pleasure, then something is not right. And that is a sign to look inward, to reflect, to work out what the problem is. And then you can work the problem backwards to get your equilibrium, your sewing equilibrium back, and you can start to enjoy it again. The thing is, if you do not assess your personal relationship with sewing, everything I've discussed in this video, the why you came to it, the why you don't want to do it, the problems that are arising, how you're going to fix it, and really assess it from a psychological standpoint. And I've talked a lot about the psychological impact and aspects of this journey. Then if you don't assess that, then you're not going to fix it and you will end up giving up. And it will be such a shame because sewing brings so many benefits. Just remember, the last time you sewed a project and you tried it on and you looked in the mirror and you thought you looked fantastic, just hold with that feeling that you felt in that moment. Bring it back, because I know you want it again and again. If you do like the psychological aspects of my storytelling, my tips and tricks for you, watch this video next, which was the previous video I published where I talked about the problems with sewing on YouTube. It's a real big psychological video and I think you're going to like it. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.